Greetings, and once again, well, aspects of Aliyah. Um, After this short break that we've had, I want to talk to you again and pick up the whole thing of anti-Semitism, and possibly one of the worst examples of anti-Semitism is the operation of the United Nations, along with the state of Iran. So, what I want to look at today is the history and the current position of the United Nations and the State of Israel. Now, the matter of Palestinian statehood and Israeli occupation continues to be framed in terms of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. UN Security Council Resolution 242 was adopted in 1967 following the Six-Day War in order to try and establish principles which is hoped would lead to the solution of the conflict. So, after lengthy discussion, the final draft for a security resolution was presented by the British ambassador, Lord Cameron. The resolution has become almost iconic in its own right and is possibly the most misinterpreted UN resolution of all time. The resolution called for peaceful land and not land for peace. Let me say that again. Peace for land, not land for peace. The formalisation granted every state in the Middle East the right to live in peace within secure and recognised borders or boundaries. The point here is that peace must be established before territorial withdrawal, unspecified, or recognised boundaries. So, in fact, in reality, Security Council Resolution 242 is not the bogeyman of international law, but more importantly, is not the blueprint for a Palestinian state. Self-determination for Palestinians, so-called, appears nowhere in the resolution. Neither does the notion of an international conference to determine this particular matter appear anywhere. The second important element in Resolution 242 is it applies only to legally constructed national states. It does not apply to terrorist groups, insurgents, and more importantly, would be self-appointed governments in exile. The expression territories occupied, importantly, is not preceded by the definite article the. Neither is the expression on all fronts involved. Therefore, obviously, it's erroneous to apply Resolution 242 in the way that it is usually presented concerning territories administered by Israel since the hostilities. It is also clear that the so-called occupied territories do not fall into the definition of any of the terms embedded in Resolution 242. So, United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly passed more resolutions critical of Israel than against all other nations combined in 2022, contributing to what any neutral observer will regard as warped and one-sided focuses on the Jewish state during meetings of the Assembly. UN Assembly approved 15 anti-Israel resolutions in 2022, as opposed to 13 resolutions criticising all other countries. According to UN Watch, Russia is a focus of only 6, condemning its invasion of Ukraine. North Korea, Afghanistan, Myanmar or Burma, Syria, Iran, and believe it or not, the USA were hit with one resolution each. Saudi Arabia, China, Lebanon, Turkey, Venezuela, and Qatar, all who are notorious for abuses of human rights, were not involved to any resolution whatsoever. Since 2015, the General Assembly has adopted 140 resolutions criticising Israel generally over its treatment of Palestinians and its relationships with neighbouring countries. Over the same period, it's only passed 68 resolutions against other countries. UN Watch says the Assembly's most recent anti-Israel resolution approved a notion that a motion should be put forward to the International Court of Justice to adjudicate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The resolution that was promoted by the Palestinians themselves passed by a vote of 87 in favour, 26 against, with 53 abstentions. Resolution heading was that Israeli practices, settlement activities affecting the rights of Palestinian people and other Arabs of occupied territories needs to be looked at. The resolution calls on the Hague-based International Court of Justice to render urgently an advisory opinion on Israel's prolonged occupation, settlement and annexation. So, to expand this in full, the resolution reads as this. At its third plenary meeting on the 16th of September 2022, the General Assembly, on the recommendation of the General Committee, decided to include in the agenda of its 77th session the item entitled Israeli Practices and Settlement Activities Affecting the Rights of the Palestinian People and Other Arabs of Occupied Territories, and this is important, and to allocate it to the Special Political and Decolonisation (12) Committee. So the ICG is the top UN court for mediating disputes between countries. Its rulings are binding and influence public opinion. However, fortunately, it has no mechanism to enforce its decision. This court is separate from the International Criminal Court, also located in The Hague, responsible for putting arrest warrants out against people like Benjamin Netanyahu and so on, which is absolutely ridiculous. Another so-called official body, which we'll come to later, is the World Health Organization, who have started to interfere in things, who are a totally unelected body. Now, other anti-Israel measures recently focus on the so-called occupied Syrian Golan. Occupied Syrian Golan, really? Palestinian refugees, nuclear proliferation, pollution in Lebanon settlements, and the stalled peace process. So, the UN has a long history of passing resolutions against Israel, and rightfully, Israel and the USA, unfortunately not the UK, accused it of extreme bias. Israel have accused the Palestinians of letting it be fairly understood have non-member observer states only at the UN of trying to use this body to circumvent peace negotiations and take advantage. Israel has protested that the ICJ resolution was both biased and dismissive of Israel's legitimate security concerns. Quick recap. Until 1967, the Arab world showed little interest in the newly coined identity Palestinians, and are also responsible for making no attempt whatsoever to resettle displaced people following the first Arab-Israeli war, which was entirely created by the Arabs. Neither did those who became Palestinians demand self-determination, as they were far more interested in part of Syria or Jordan until they were politically compromised. So, the Palestinians themselves historically were never a people and were never even misrepresented as such by themselves or the Arab world until the 1970s. It is in this period that Judea and Samaria became known in terms of occupied territories. How can you occupy territory in your own land? A legal mystery, but well accepted by the UN. East Jerusalem became known as Arab Jerusalem. Region inhabited by Jews became known as settlements, and the UN readily accepted this terminology, which came to pass into common usage and to this day remains a deliberately erroneous designation. Question: have UN resolutions got any real value? Good question. Charles Powell pointed out that the UN has been an organisation of convenience used by countries when it serves their benefits and ignored when it does not. And the number of both morally and defensible wars of aggression fought without UN permission is legion. Now, since the UN's inception in 1945, there have been 400 wars and other military conflicts, not including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So how have the UN dealt with these things? Now, North Korea is the world's foremost distributor of weapons, and they assumed the presidency of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament. You couldn't make that up, could you? But I'm going to say this again. North Korea assumed the presidency of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament on the 30th of May 1922 in order to lead global efforts at transparency on nuclear arms, ending nuclear proliferation, and preventing nuclear war. Anybody who watches the news on a regular basis will say that that is ludicrous in the extreme. Now, this is the thing, I think, that is the beginning of the great undermining of the UN, which we'll come to in a minute after our break. Welcome back. So, to show the legitimacy of the operation of the United Nations and its anti-Semitic bias, I'd like to just roll us back nearly 50 years to the days of the PLO. So, on the 13th of November 1974, although not a representative of an acknowledged nation or state, Yasser Arafat, as a leader of a pseudo-national identity, has the distinction of being the only person ever allowed to carry a firearm, albeit without ammunition, into a meeting of the Assembly. He demanded Israel's withdrawal from all Palestinian territories, although there are no such things, occupied in 1967, to have them placed under temporary UN supervision and to convene an international peace conference. When he mounted the platform, he announced, "Today I've come bearing an olive branch and the freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." Unbelievable. Some 20 years later, in 1988, the US Department of State cited that due to associations with terrorism, an application for a visa to enter the United States by request of the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat will be rejected, and as such he will not be allowed to travel to New York to speak at the UN General Assembly. Hold your breath for a minute. Incredulously, the General Assembly promptly voted overwhelmingly to cancel the meeting and to reconvene 1 month later in Switzerland in order to give audience to Yasser Arafat.
If you are a Christian, then there is no question that you owe a great debt to the Jewish people. Unto them were entrusted the oracles of God. What does that mean? It means, if not for the faithfulness of the Jewish people, we would not have this. And therefore you would not know your God, and you would not know his Son.
Israel and the Jewish people are under attack right now, and we owe them everything. The least that we can do is support them in their hour of need. So please go to EzraInternational.org and give to the Emergency Relief Fund, and your dollars will be used to help displaced and traumatized Jewish people throughout the land.
And remember, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jewish people from another place. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Please go to EzraInternational.org and give your best gift today.
In 2007, Iran, that was then and still is racing towards an aggressive nuclear advancement, was appointed to the vice chair of the Disarmament Commission. In 2017, the UN appointed Saudi Arabia, where at the time women were constrained to wear the hijab, could not go anywhere, even to the police, without their male guardian, to head this Women's Rights Commission. In 2020, China, known to have at least 1 million people confined in abusive concentration camps, was appointed to join the United Nations Human Rights Council panel. Almost unbelievable, isn't it? I'd just like to move on with a good view. The UN has been accused by the international lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, the Nobel laureate, human rights activist, and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, and A. Bayevsky, lawyer, scholar, and activist, Leonard Rustin, the human rights activist, and the noted historian Robert Wistrate, and feminist theologians and activists Phyllis Kessler and Sonia Johnson of tolerating anti-Semitic remarks beneath walls. Robert Wistrate commented, after speaking to the above, that Israeli delegates to the United Nations have been treated to a sickening litany of anti-Semitic abuse at the General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Commission, and sometimes even the Security Council for decades. So, in the last few minutes, let's look at the UN's stance since October the 7th. UNRWA, the United Nations Agency, dedicated solely to the Palestinians, both supports and incites terror against Israelis. At least 12 UNRWA staffers were directly involved in Hamas's October 7th attacks. They included murdering and kidnapping Israelis, not to mention the torture and slaughter of children, setting them alight, beheading them, and so on. And roughly 10% of all UNRWA employees in Gaza have direct ties to Hamas. UNRWA employees also glorified the mass attacks and encouraged further executions of Israelis. Their headquarters in Gaza was located above a half-mile-long tunnel network where the mass intelligence agencies and their communication hubs drew all their power and etc., shall we say, from the UN's facilities. United Nations women failed to condemn the war crimes against Israeli women until shamed into doing so. This body, that's supposed to champion women's rights, was completely silent on Hamas's well-documented mass murder, rape and torture of Israeli women and girls before the call to account some 2 months later. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, singles out Israel's condemnation. Guterres invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, which allows the Secretary-General to bring any matter unilaterally to the UN Security Council attention that he believes threatens international peace and security. In over 3 decades, the UN has only invoked this article to pressure Israel. Let me say that again. In over 3 decades, the UN has only invoked this article to pressure Israel. Guterres also sought to, if you can believe this, he also sought to justify Hamas's attack by saying it is important to recognise the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffering occupation. UN resolutions have repeatedly failed to condemn Hamas. The UN General Assembly overwhelmingly on the 27th and on December the 13th, calling for an immediate ceasefire, would leave Hamas in power and still armed. The US happily vetoed the 2 Security Council resolutions that also called for immediate ceasefire with Hamas. However, it should be said that these 2 resolutions in October and December, none of them condemned Hamas's attack, didn't mention the terror group by name, or affirmed Israel's right to self-defense. The International Court of Justice indulges what the US calls meritless, counterproductive genocide charged against Israel. By agreeing to hear South Africa's genocide case, which it might be worth mentioning was sanctioned by Southern Ireland, though it might also be mentioned sided with Nazis in World War II, agreed to hear the case rather than dismissing it outright. The ICJ, to this day, is giving legitimate reasons to South Africa's outrageous, libelous, and dangerous allegations, albeit passive at the moment. Anti-Israeli organisations are investigating the charges against the UNRWA staff. Anti-Israel organisations are doing the investigations. At least 2 of the 3 organisations tasked with this investigation that employed terrorists have made anti-Israel statements or defended UNRWA. Leading the investigation is the former French Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna, who recently praised UNRWA's work as more useful than it has ever been. UN officials justify Hamas's October 7th attack and still refuse to denounce terrorism. In response to French President Emmanuel Macron's statement that October the 7th was the biggest anti-Semitic massacre of our century, UN Special Reporter Francesca Albanese justified the attack by saying that the victims of October the 7th were not killed because of their Judaism, but in response to Israeli oppression. The UN Relief Chief, Martin Griffiths, said in a recent interview, Hamas is not a terrorist group. As you know, it is simply a political movement. So there you are. That's United Nations. Not a disgrace, anti-Semitic, and not fit for purpose. So, we might want to look at the events of the last week. The UN are working overtime against Israel's plan to completely annex Gaza to take control of aid distribution. It's well known, or should be well known, that all aid that goes into Gaza is controlled by Hamas, who employ it for their own purposes. If the aid is financial, they take it for their own purposes, and most of the Hamas, many of them don't even live there, live millionaire lifestyles. Other money is used to procure weapons and military hardware. Foods and medicines taken by Hamas, used for themselves or sold on, and they're used as a controlling mechanism against the population. So the UN has condemned Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, and condemned Israel for going to take complete annexation of their own territory and take control over the aid. The UN have raised their hands in horror about this, and to join the clamour, the anti-Semitic clamour, let me say this clearly, the unelected World Health Organization, who are quite a sinister organisation anyway, who seem to feel that they can interfere in national politics concerning health issues, but they've got involved in this now as well. So, I'm going to conclude this broadcast and appeal to you to read the news. Monitor and follow the United Nations, possibly one of the greatest anti-Semitic institutions in modern history. Terrible thought, isn't it? One of the most anti-Semitic organisations in modern history. Now, we all have our own responsibilities when it comes to these sort of things. So, pray against influences of the UN. Lobby your governmental representatives. But surely we can't live in a world where the United Nations is one of the world's largest opinion makers, and I've got to say this would be world dominating military forces if they were allowed to get there. So next time we're going to speak about the way the world is changing and how Jewish people fit into it. So in the meantime, God be with you until we meet again.